80-year-old man, apparently fit and healthy, is suddenly found dead by a neighbour.
He was a very independent man, still quite active and working for a local caravan park, doing 2 or 3 days' work as a handyman.
John Proctor was a man with no apparent enemies.
John was one in a million, a great British eccentric.
And was very well respected in the community and well liked.
And his violent death was inexplicable. But somebody in his close-knit family had a secret, an addiction, and it was eating away at her.
How on earth could somebody end up with such a problem? It's really unthinkable.
Susan Warne's case is an illustration of a woman driven wild with despair, irrational thoughts and feelings.
I think it makes it just that much more horrific, that much sadder, really.
Criminologists agree. Men and women kill for different reasons and in different ways. When a woman murders, it's often in rage, jealousy, passion. This is the series that looks into the hearts and minds of the lady killers. Leiston, a quiet market town near England's Suffolk coast. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody else, and where no unusual incidents go unnoticed. No surprise then that John Proctor's neighbour did notice that there was something amiss at his tiny terraced house on Grimsey Road in the town.
On a warm and sunny Monday morning in June, a neighbour noticed that John Proctor's curtains were not open.
He found the back door to be insecure, walked in, and as he went into the building he found John laying at the bottom of the stairs with what looked to be a knife in his neck at that time.
To say Leiston was in shock is an understatement. Who would have wanted to kill a man like John Proctor? Fergus Little was John's former boss in the campsite where he still worked 3 days a week.
He was fantastic, always on time, always came in, always very pleasant to work around, just generally a nice guy, and yeah, he was a good employee.
He was an 80-year-old man, but very fit, very active. Neighbours reported that he was a man in really good health.
John Proctor was evacuated from London during World War II. It was in Leiston, a friendly coastal town, that he found refuge and ended up staying for the rest of his life.
He'd been adopted by a lady who lived in Leiston 70 odd years ago, and that lady had adopted another daughter 5 or 6 years later, so they become brother and sister, if you like, within that family environment. John never married, never had any children himself, but his sister went on to have 4 children, and he was always well known as uncle to those 4 children, and were quite a family unit within that area.
After John's death, his nieces, who were his foster sister's daughters, said what a well-liked man he was. He loved Halloween and would spend a fortune on sweets for the children. Fit, active, and a very much liked man.
So why would someone kill him? Most murders are committed by people who know their victims well, partners, friends, lovers, workmates. But there appeared to detectives that there was no grudge-laden relationship in John's life, no bitter exes.
That he was single, apparently a lifelong bachelor.
Loyal to friends and those he worked for too, throughout decades.
when he was working for my father sort of 40 years ago, he was helping in the winter, putting in infrastructure, trenching, doing all the work that you need to run somewhere like this. When he was working for me, he tended to be looking after a lot of the plants.
John's friends talked about his quirky sense of humour, how he brought a smile to the faces of everybody he met.
He was just a bit different. Yeah, he just looked upon life differently. Whenever he used to come in, he would invariably in the morning, when we were all stood chatting before the day started, would come out with something, and it would just be something a little bit off the wall. So yeah, I think that's an eccentric, but a good man.
As for his family, a sister and 4 nieces, no problems there either, or so it initially seemed. To all appearances, his was a close-knit family. Nobody had a motive to kill him, but there was an ingredient in the life of Uncle John that he didn't want. One of his nieces had a secret, one which would ultimately lead to his murder. Susan Warne was a gambler, constantly in need of money, and she knew where to get it, from Uncle John.
Susan really used the love and affection that John had for her as his niece to prey on his trust.
The investigation which followed the discovery of John's body would reveal an undercurrent of addiction in parts of this isolated community. The kind of addiction that gets fewer headlines than many: gambling. It was the superficially innocuous British pastime of bingo alongside a compulsion for playing the slots which would take over the life of one of those close to John, somebody whose life was very different from the way it appeared.
John's niece, Susan Warne, grew up, got married and had a couple of children, and had a dog, and would enjoy long walks in the fields that were merely a stone's throw away from their home in Valley Road. She lived a fairly ordinary life. She owned a landscape gardening business, and people said she was pretty good at that, but sadly, it all began to crumble.
Illness and injury forced Susan Warne to leave the job that she loved.
She was hospitalised with stomach issues, and shortly after, she sustained a shoulder injury.
She had to quit that job and became a cleaner at a local Tesco.
Being a cleaner meant she received wages, but her mental health seems to have been affected by a loss of status.
There would have been a huge loss of identity, loss of self-esteem, and I would expect too a loss of a way of staying mentally and emotionally healthy.
Liz Carter is a therapist and specialist in gambling addiction amongst women.
Being outside in fresh air, being outdoors, engaged in physical activity is something that lots of people who suffer with stress and anxiety find hugely beneficial. So it sounds like she would have hit a perfect storm emotionally and mentally in many ways. To lose a job that obviously she found very satisfying and would have been, I imagine, closely connected with her identity and her self-esteem, that would have had an impact.
Seeking comfort, perhaps looking for a way to escape her problems, Susan turned to gambling.
Her chosen method of gambling was online, but I think also she used other methods of gambling.
She would regularly visit amusement parks in nearby seaside towns and would spend hours in front of the fruit machines. She was looking for a distraction, but perhaps she thought she could turn things around and win herself some money.
It looked like an innocent enough pastime at first, but Susan began to lose control.
Susan's probably started gambling online and become more and more ingrained in that kind of behaviour, gambling more and more money, and of course the bigger the debt, the bigger you gamble to try and pay off that debt. So it's a downward spiral of gambling that led to the position that she was in.
And the salary or wage she was receiving just could not keep up with the demands of her addiction. So she was spending money as quickly, or if not quicker, than she was earning it.
When did Susan Warne's problem become so severe that she stopped playing the role of wife, mother, worker and niece?
Susan's friends and family knew things weren't quite right, but she wasn't much of a talker.
The ability to express our feelings helps us to stay well and healthy. If somebody is suppressing their feelings, as it sounds like Susan was, then that burden can begin to feel intolerable.
Could or should someone have realised that things were taking such a dark and desperate turn?
Susan played the slots, went online for bingo, lost money, lost more money, and ultimately turned to the man in her life who would bail her out, a man who would one day be killed for his kindness, a man unwittingly and by proxy caught up in a world of gambling. John Proctor.
There are just no winners in any of these kind of cases, just very sad.
To understand the forces at play in the world of Susan Warne, which John Proctor knew nothing about, means understanding the grip that gambling can have. What had started as a distraction, a hobby, a way of perhaps making a few pounds on the side, had turned into a crippling habit.
Susan Warne was using gambling to escape the problems of her day-to-day life.
It acts almost as an anti-anxiety or an antidepressant. At that time she's gambling, nothing else matters. Her thoughts stop and all her feelings about her problems stops. In my practice now, I'd say 98% of the women I work with are addicted to online gambling. It's a very, very similar psychology to the traditional slot machine. It's just staring at a screen, engaging in very repetitive behaviour where just for that time, everything stops.
But Susan was no winner. Time may have stopped as she gambled, but the debts did not. Susan's gambling wasn't the solution to her problems, it was the cause. Far from making money, she was losing it hand over fist.
She wasn't making much money because she was on a cleaner's salary, and she couldn't afford to lose what little she did have.
For a while, it can be an effective escapism. But of course, because it's gambling, that appeal, which is losing touch with reality, is also a huge part of the problem, because she's going to very quickly lose touch with the reality of how much money she's spent until there's no more money. And then panic sets in. And we've got to remember this is a woman who is driven to please other people, feels hugely ashamed and guilty at having lost all of the money.
Susan Warne was stuck on a downward spiral, one she simply could not escape.
Most women who've had a gambling addiction describe self-loathing, huge guilt, and the way they stop themselves thinking or feeling about the destruction that the gambling has caused is to repeat the gambling act, because when they're gambling, they're not thinking or feeling anything about their behaviour. And of course, it just repeats the cycle. They gamble again, they beg, they steal or borrow to get money to gamble again. When they're gambling, they think and feel nothing. Afterwards, huge guilt and regret and remorse, and the drive to gamble again to stop all of that for that moment. So by that stage, sadly, it's gambling at all costs. And I think that's what we saw with Susan.
Susan's family eventually started to notice that something was amiss.
Susan's father said she wasn't one for discussing her problems, but one Christmas, 2 years before all this came to a head, she didn't buy anybody in the family a Christmas present.
In 2014, she'd lost almost £5,000 and had to take out a bank loan to cover her debts. She'd then started gambling again, and her debts had grown and grown. In fact, her husband had taken out a bank loan of £16,000 to pay off her gambling debts, but Susan didn't stop.
Susan's family clearly wanted to help, but they just didn't know how.
It's really tough to see a loved one suffering financially. But what I know is that to bail somebody out financially doesn't usually help. In absolute crisis, the person who's got the gambling addiction will absolutely mean what they say. You know, if you give me this money, this will be the last time. I'm going to pay off my debts and I'll stop. And they mean it. Because in that crisis, they are in such pain, such desperation, they won't want to put themselves through that again. But the fact is that if they pay off their debts and they don't seek help, it's very, very likely that those cravings to gamble will arise again.
The challenge facing Susan was not how to stop gambling as she saw it, but how to afford it. One day she felt she would win big. Maybe then she could stop. Until then, it was a question of feeding the habit.
Susan couldn't think about anything else apart from when she was going to gamble again and where she was going to get the money to do it.
Susan became so desperate to fund her addiction that she started targeting those she loved the most.
Susan had stolen money from her husband and her young son, but that's what addicts do. They are blind and deaf to the consequences of their actions.
Susan's network of contacts was not a large one. The most likely victims of her crimes were going to be her own family.
She'd borrowed money from her father and then later on heard that he'd had a bit of luck on the horses and then broke into his house and stole almost £1,000 from him.
He reported it to the police, but soon afterwards discovered that Susan was the culprit. He had her charged, but, as families so often do, they forgave Susan.
The situation was dire, but this was far from Susan's rock bottom. Her criminal behaviour was about to get worse. Deceit and thieving were about to turn to violence.
A 90-year-old lady was attacked in the pretty little town of Walberswick, which has a population of only 380 people. Susan had tried to mug this lady, and this was only 3 days before John Proctor's death.
There was an attempted robbery on an elderly woman. Susan Warne was charged with that. She would later go on to face trial for that robbery.
The latest line had been crossed. Susan had begun gambling. Petty theft followed to pay for it, and she escalated to the more serious cases of stealing. Now, she had turned violent.
Susan was completely out of control. All she could think about was her gambling addiction and when she would get her next fix.
Over the course of just a few years, Susan Warne had descended from respected landscape gardener, much-loved mother, wife and daughter, to a desperate addict whose habit knew no bounds.
This is not a woman who was shy of committing crimes to feed her habit.
Susan Warne's case, as far as I'm aware, is an illustration of a woman driven, obviously wild with despair, irrational thoughts and feelings, which are the consequence of a long-term gambling addiction. I think it's a terribly sad case which was taken to the extreme.
Where would Susan's desperate, dangerous cravings take her next? To the door of her uncle, John Proctor. It was late in the morning of June 15th, 2015, that neighbours of John Proctor, an 80-year-old man who lived alone, noticed that his curtains were still drawn.
John Proctor was an independent man. He was organised, tidy, and a creature of habit. When his curtains weren't opened, that rang alarm bells.
We'd last seen him the week before when he was at work. He'd come in, he used to do 3 days a week. So he'd finished his 3 days, and so we were expecting him to come into work that day.
A neighbour let themselves into the house through the door at the back. They walked through the kitchen, the hallway, and towards the front door. And that's when they found John's body. It was a scene of absolute horror, a scene that neighbour may never forget.
So the neighbour quickly retreated from the house, went back to his home and phoned both the police and ambulance service, and the police attended within sort of 15 minutes of that call.
Word of a murder mystery in a picturesque English county was spreading fast. John Proctor, a man known for cheery hellos around the town, as an eccentric colleague, as a loving uncle, was dead, and the police were involved. Kevin Haywood would become the lead investigator. Immediately he knew this was not a routine case of an elderly person dying from a fall down the stairs.
When the police went in, as did the ambulance crew, they found John laying at the bottom of the stairs. Glasses were close to him, just off his face, and there was indeed a knife in his neck, which obviously makes the scenario very suspicious, and looks like there's been third-party involvement in the death of John.
Journalists like Tom Potter were quickly on the scene.
We had learnt that there was a police cordon in Grimsby Road, so we banded together and tried to get as close to what seemed to be the property in question. But it was very, very difficult to get anywhere near that property. More or less the entire street was cordoned off with police cars at each end and police tape.
Assessed the scene, and with a crime scene investigator made the decision to call this an unexplained death at that moment in time, which needed further explanation as to how John had met his death.
But this was hardly what was expected from life in Leiston. Before all of the details emerged, locals and those who knew John could not countenance that the cause of his death was anything but natural.
It never crossed our minds that something bad had happened, because it's not something you'd expect to happen, and certainly not something that any of us here had ever really experienced or come across. So we assumed that he had passed away, and then when we heard it was cordoned off, it was a bit of, I wonder what that's all about.
We learned that it was a man in his 80s who had been found, I think he'd been dead for a couple of days, and had been found at the foot of his stairs.
There didn't look to be any kind of fight that had gone on in the address itself. Very compact, tiny, but tidy address.
Police were at a loss. Leiston is not a place known for what appeared a gratuitous act of violence.
It's almost unheard of for something quite so serious to happen in Leiston. I mean, it's not absolved from all kinds of crime, but when somebody is killed, then it sends shockwaves around that community.
It was probably a day or so after, where we'd obviously heard a lot of it was rumours and second and third hand, but after you heard enough that you realised that something horrific had happened.
What struck investigators was the incongruity of what had happened. Superficially, it seemed a motiveless murder.
Complete shock, I mean, absolute shock and devastation. You know, John lived his life very quietly, went around his business in his own way, had his little job at the caravan park, but nobody could really give an explanation as to, you know, that he would have upset anybody, annoyed anybody, or given any cause for any person, any reason to kill.
The post-mortem confirmed what earlier tenders knew. This was no accident.
He was found to have broken some bones, probably as a result of a heavy fall down the stairs. There were stab wounds to his neck, which severed the carotid artery, and also there were signs of strangulation.
The cause of death was found to be compression of the neck, and it was believed that was caused by a curtain cord from John's own home.
The force of the attack would normally have been associated with a man. It was a truly brutal murder. At this point, it appeared most likely that a man had attempted a burglary and been surprised by John before panicking. Police didn't have any immediate suspects, but they did find a clue in John's living room that pointed to a possible motive.
What was noted was there was a wallet on the mantelpiece in the address, had John's driving licence in it, but had no money in it. And that was to prove quite interesting as the inquiry.
They made further inquiries with neighbours to find out more about John's final days. They learned a lot, and quickly, in a place where most people knew most people.
Leiston is a very small, close-knit community. John had lived in that street all his life. Everybody knew each other in that street, helped each other out, and the neighbours were very, very helpful. In fact, told us that on Saturday morning, one of the neighbours in the street had seen John in his garden. They'd had a conversation, so that helps us in narrowing the time down, in knowing that John was still alive on that Saturday morning.
What had happened to John Proctor in the 48 hours between that sighting on Saturday and Monday morning when his body was tragically found? One by one, clues began to reveal themselves.
The neighbours made another interesting revelation about John's final moments. He had been expecting a caller.
He was expecting his niece, Susan Warne.
One of the neighbours, in conversation with John had told them that one of his nieces was having some kind of matrimonial problems and that they may well be coming to live with him for a few days.
Clearly, detectives desperately needed to speak to John's loved ones, especially Susan Warne.
We informed the family and they were, again, completely shocked, devastated as to how or why anybody would want to murder John in his own home.
As detectives made inquiries of the family, it soon became clear that all was not well. Susan Warne's secrets were about to be laid bare.
Close family, all the four nieces were very close together, but very quickly it became established that one of the nieces, Susan Warne, had a gambling habit, had a number of debts in relation to gambling.
She kept going, and at the time of this murder, she owed another £3,000.
To addiction experts, Susan's spiral was neither surprising and not to be taken lightly.
I always think with addiction, there but for the grace of God go any of us. Anything that we find enjoyable, we may be turned to in times of stress, be it a glass of wine, a box of chocolates, or gambling. I think we need to be careful if we are regularly using anything, particularly something that has very harmful effects and potentially can lead to devastating addictions, if we're using it regularly at times when we're feeling sad or scared or angry. We're using it to change our mood for the better, and the particular problem with gambling, of course, is that it does cost vast amounts of money.
Could Susan's crippling gambling debts be the motive for such a ferocious attack on an elderly man? And what might a woman in Susan's desperate state of mind do next? Police needed to track her down, and quickly.
As Monday developed, we were making inquiries with all the four nieces. Police officers had been deployed to go and speak to Susan, and as they were on the way to go and speak to Susan, a phone call came in from Susan's husband to say that a suicide note from her had been left at her home address and that she'd gone off and nobody knew where she was at that particular time.
Obviously the guilt got to her. She wanted to attempt to take her life and wrote a suicide note and took an overdose of painkillers.
Susan's husband, the neighbours and the police all set out to find her. They didn't know what they might find. Had she done herself some harm? What was her state of mind? Should they even approach her?
There was a local search in the local areas. I believe there was a walkway where Susan used to walk a dog. They were all checked, and as the night developed, Susan was found hiding underneath a tree, clearly not well physically, so therefore she was found and removed to Ipswich Hospital.
Detectives would have to wait an agonising 36 hours before they could demand answers from her. What kind of story would she tell? The contents of her suicide note, written for her family, left a clue.
She left a note for her husband which said, I didn't mean for this to happen. I can't take any more.
Police look after the children and the dog. I can't take it anymore.
Had Susan's terrible gambling addiction finally driven her to do something unthinkable?
When we found the suicide note at her home address, all those things start to come together to lead to think that Susan's the suspect for the murder of Mr. Proctor.
"80-year-old John Proctor was dead, found strangled and stabbed in the neck in the hallway of the terraced house that he'd lived his entire life. All the evidence for this shocking murder was pointing at John's niece, 41-year-old Susan Warne, a wife and mother who was in the grip of a crippling addiction to online bingo games. She'd attempted suicide, leaving a note that seemed filled with guilt and remorse. But when police finally got to sit down with their prime suspect, nothing she said added up.
Police interviewed Susan about the murder of John Proctor, and initially she tried to deny it.
The addict was in denial, and she denied her crime compulsively, just as she gambled. She did not do it. She could not have done it. She wasn't even there.
We interviewed Susan on 4 occasions between Wednesday and Friday. So Susan gives us an account of her movements over the weekend. She says she finished John early on in the morning, but she says that she hasn't told him anything about a matrimonial breakdown. She says she just fancied to go and see him for a cup of tea. We found that slightly strange.
Outside of the interview room, as police continued their inquiries, they built a picture of Susan's life, one which was in complete disarray.
Her husband and her children informed us of the gambling addiction that Susan had and the amounts of money that she had built up in debt.
They told the police about the money that she'd stolen from them and the loans that she'd taken out to cover her debts. But sadly, she just could not stop.
But police kept pulling on the thread of those gambling rumours.
For the first 3 occasions she told us her account that yes, she'd been to see John, she had nothing to do with his murder.
And over time, Susan's lies started to unravel.
She did tell us that she'd visited Lowestoft, and we did do some CCTV work in and around Lowestoft, and we did get her in one of the bingo venues, or leaving one of the bingo venues in Lowestoft around that time.
The truth emerged. She had killed, she had robbed, and then gone on a gambling spree with the money.
She went pretty much straight to an arcade in Lowestoft, a seaside town in North Suffolk, and was gambling straight away.
Run all the financial transactions as well, and what could be seen is that bank transactions were chaotic, lots of money going in and out, lots of money to pay off debts. But what you could see was there's on the Monday morning, 2 deposits made of £150 into her account. Her gambling was online predominantly. We think that the money may well have been deposited over the weekend, but only registered on the Monday when the banking system started to come live again on that Monday morning. So yes, there was some evidence in those deposits that equated to something close to the same value of money that had been stolen from Mr. Proctor's home.
Despite so much damning evidence against her, Susan continued to deny her crime.
The police had a suicide note which sounded like an admission of guilt. They had CCTV of Susan playing slot machines soon after John's death, and there was evidence from the bank of 2 substantial deposits into her account.
Then police made a discovery that was to become the tipping point in the case against Susan Warne.
When we took possession of Susan's mobile phone, and there was a sort of a video log on that mobile phone that we managed to extract, which again just gave us a little bit more detail. And the wording, I can't be exact on the wording, but the video content said something along the lines of, "I'm sorry for what I've done, I can't take it anymore, I love you all."
I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen.
Who knows why Susan chose that moment to confess? Maybe it had all become too much for her, or perhaps she just wanted to unburden herself.
As we put that content of that video diary to Susan in an interview and put the question to her that was she responsible for Mr. Proctor's death, she broke down, put her head in her hands, said, yes, I can't take it anymore, I need to tell you the truth.
Susan Warne was finally ready to tell homicide detectives what she'd done to John Proctor, a man she'd always called Uncle. It was a disturbing tale.
On the 13th of June, Susan went round to visit her uncle. She claimed that her husband had thrown her out and she had nowhere to stay. And of course, John let her in. John was a very kind-hearted man, and he looked upon Susan as a real niece, as a blood relative. He wasn't going to let any woman be alone on the streets with nowhere to go, least of all his niece. So of course, he let her in.
She had told him that she was having matrimonial problems. Mr. Proctor had taken her upstairs, shown her to the bedroom that she could stay in for a few nights, because she said that, told Mr. Proctor that she'd been sleeping in her car.
He was happy to have her living there as part of his family.
Susan wasn't there to play happy families. She was relying on her uncle's generosity to take pity on her and to help her in her moment of need.
We think that she went there to steal some money. She just saw it as an opportune time to cause Mr. Proctor's harm, to allow her to steal from him and from his home.
What happened next was truly shocking.
The moment she was upstairs, she turned on John. She pushed him down the stairs. John sustained fractures and significant bruises.
It was a fall that broke his arm and immobilised him.
He's lying at the bottom of the stairs, but that's not enough for Susan.
Susan's next horrifying act would defy all belief. Having pushed her Uncle John down the stairs, grievously injuring him, what made her continue the attack?
In that terrible moment when she feared being discovered, that there was no conscious thought about what she did, that it would have been just a reaction, I imagine, to pure fear. Here's the moment at which everything that I've been hiding through shame and guilt is going to be discovered. And in that moment, had what we could consider a childlike reaction, not feeling able to cope with the situation. Instant, instinctive reaction to terror.
In Warne's mind, the stakes were too high. It would be a gamble to let him live and identify his attacker. Perhaps if he survived, he might forgive her. But this was one wager she couldn't leave to chance.
She explained that not only had she strangled him with the curtain cord, but he'd been making gurgling noises that she'd found too hard to bear. She'd stabbed him in the neck, and when he carried on making those noises, she'd stabbed him again.
She then went and taken the knife to him to make sure that he was dead, and she said the reasons that she did that was because he would be able to identify her, that she pushed him down the stairs, so that she needed to kill him.
But if Susan Warne had never planned to kill her uncle, it was what she did next which showed a chilling lack of concern for the kind and decent man that she'd left lifeless in a pool of blood at the bottom of the stairs.
Once Susan was satisfied that John Proctor was dead, she stole £300 from him.
She had deposited some of it into her bank account too.
She then went out to dinner with her husband and her children as though nothing had happened.
How had her life spiralled so dramatically out of control? From mother, professional gardener, wife, to murderer. How did a liking for slot machines and bingo lead to the death of an innocent, much-loved pensioner?
This case is quite severe. The gambling addiction must have been massive for Susan Warne to kill a man that she'd known all her life for a small sum of £300.
A relatively small amount of money, and a life lost because of bingo and slot machines.
You can imagine how this type of addiction might start quite small. Perhaps you have a bet of £3, £4, £5, maybe £10, and slowly it grows. And of course, every time you have a small win, it fires you up to think that you might have more. Every time you have a loss, you feel as though you need to gamble again to make up that loss.
Susan Warne was utterly in the grip of a gambling addiction.
We believe that she'd received her monthly salary on the Friday before the murder, and from what we can see from her gambling habits, she gambled all that money away on the Friday night. So that probably tells you how far Susan Warne was into gambling those kinds of sums of money, and how desperate she was for that buzz to go gambling again on Saturday to warrant murdering her uncle, who she's known all her life, in his own home.
What we do see always is extreme behaviour when someone has an addiction. That person is unrecognisable to themselves. They're being driven by strong emotions and irrational thought. The desperation to get money is not only about covering their tracks where the addiction is concerned, but it is also desperation to get the fix.
And getting her fix had cost a man his life and left an entire family, indeed an entire community, devastated.
This was somebody who admitted what they had done. She clearly realised how bad her addiction had become. Her family didn't really gather just how bad it had become, and I think that they were very sorry for that and didn't see it coming.
There are just no winners in any of these kind of scenarios. Mr. Proctor's lost his life. He should have been able to enjoy his last few years of life, enjoying what he wanted to do, and Susan's lost at least 20 years of her life incarcerated in prison, and her family has suffered as well as a result of this.
At the trial, the judge compared Susan's addiction to gambling to that of a heroin addict, and it's true that buzz that a gambler gets after a win is very similar to the high of taking drugs. And Susan was trapped in this cycle of always wanting more, always wanting another high, another fix. Certainly, Susan found that she was completely out of control. She could only think about where her next fix was coming from and how she was going to pay for it. And in this case, murder was the ultimate price to pay.
Susan Warne pleaded guilty to murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, and she will have to serve at least 19 years.